It was Father's Day, and my daughter, Julia, handed me a simple $5 razor, acting as if it were a valuable gift. At the same time, she gave her father-in-law, Robert, a brand-new Harley-Davidson motorcycle worth about $20,000, which she had purchased with my own funds. She had once called this money a vital expense. Later, she would call me repeatedly, pleading with me to stop what I was doing, but it was already too late. I'd started down a path from which there was no turning back. I tore at the wrapping paper, and the sound it made reminded me of stepping on dry autumn leaves. My fingers were deliberate as I peeled back the edges. My daughter, Julia, watched me with that familiar bright smile, the one that never seemed to show in her eyes. Her husband, Logan, stood nearby, nervously toying with his beer bottle. Julia's voice was a bit too loud as she wished me a happy Father's Day from across their perfectly maintained backyard, and she told me she had chosen this gift specifically for me. The gift box felt unusually light in my hands. I opened it to find a single, disposable razor, tucked into some tissue paper that looked like it had been repurposed from Christmas. It was the kind of cheap item you might buy in a hurry at a gas station. A razor, I noted, turning the package over in my hand. A price sticker on the back read $4.99. Julia settled into her chair and explained that since I always mentioned the cost of high-end electric razors, she thought this was a much more sensible option for a man my age, without any complicated buttons or charging cables. Hearing the words "someone my age" felt like a physical blow. I tried to force a look of gratitude onto my face. My lie about her thoughtfulness felt bitter in my mouth. Just 3 months before, Julia had called me, sobbing about an emergency surgery her brother-in-law, Logan's brother, supposedly needed. Without hesitation, I went to the bank and withdrew $20,000 from the retirement fund I had built over many years of working extra shifts at the factory. I had given her that check without a second thought because a father provides for his children. Julia's condescending tone, the same one she used with her older clients at her bank job, continued as she noted how practical I always was. Logan, meanwhile, kept shifting his weight, his eyes glued to the beer bottle in his hand. He hadn't been able to meet my gaze since I'd signed away the money. My hands were surprisingly steady as I placed the razor on the patio table, the plastic making a quiet click against the glass. The Montana evening was a perfect, golden June twilight, and the atmosphere should have been celebratory. Instead, I was in the backyard I had helped them buy, holding a cheap razor and wondering at what point Julia had stopped thinking of me as her father and started viewing me as a burden. Julia suddenly became very animated, bouncing with excitement in her chair. She announced that she had forgotten about another surprise. Logan's bottle slipped, splashing beer on his shirt, and he started to protest, but she ignored him. Her face was glowing with an excitement that made my stomach churn. She insisted I was going to love it and beckoned us to follow her to the garage, her sandals clicking on the concrete. Logan walked behind her as if he were being led to an execution, and I followed, holding the razor in my sweating hand. As the automatic garage door rumbled open, Julia was practically vibrating with anticipation. I could hear another vehicle in the distance. It was Robert, Logan's father, arriving for what I had thought was a shared celebration. Julia's eyes were gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she whispered that his timing was perfect and that this would be absolutely ideal. The garage air was thick with the scent of motor oil and new rubber. In the center of the garage, a brand-new Harley-Davidson motorcycle gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking like a monument to my betrayal. Julia stood next to it, her arms wide, as if she were a game show host revealing a grand prize. I heard Logan's father's truck door slam behind me, followed by his footsteps on the gravel. My throat felt completely dry, and I could only manage to whisper a question about what it was. Julia ran a hand along the pristine fuel tank, her voice thick with pride as she noted that it was a 2025 Street Glide and that it had taken her months to find the perfect one. Robert appeared in the doorway, his confused smile transforming into something else as he asked whose motorcycle it was. With a grin that could have lit up the entire neighborhood, Julia told him it was his and wished him a happy Father's Day. Robert's jaw went slack, and he stumbled forward, reaching for the handlebars as if the bike might vanish. He told Julia he couldn't accept such an expensive gift. Julia, however, triumphantly announced that it cost $20,000, was brand new and fully loaded. everything he had ever wanted. The number $20,000 felt like a punch to my gut. My vision narrowed, and the garage began to spin. That was the exact amount I had given Julia for Logan's brother's supposed surgery, and the exact amount I had signed away from my retirement savings because I believed my daughter was in need. Robert told Julia that it was too much and that he couldn't accept such a valuable gift. But she waved him off, giving a pointed look toward Logan, who was staring intently at his shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. She said that some people, after all, deserved the very best and had earned a little luxury in their lives. It seemed that I wasn't one of those people. I stood there, still holding my cheap razor, as my daughter gave another man's father a gift that was worth 4,000 times more than the one she had given me. Tears streamed down Robert's face as he remarked that this was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for him, and wondered how she had managed it. Julia's voice was dripping with false modesty as she explained that she had been very careful with her money and had made some strategic investments. The word strategic echoed in my head like a gunshot. I thought about how she had been strategic about lying to me, about using my love to fund her gift for someone else, and about making me feel like an idiot. Julia turned to me with a look of feigned concern, asking if I was all right because I looked a little pale. I was unable to speak, afraid of what might come out if I tried. I simply nodded and gave a weak smile, the same kind of smile I had worn at my wife's funeral when people said everything would be okay. Robert was now examining every inch of the motorcycle, running his hands over the chrome pipes and leather seat as he remarked on the incredible craftsmanship of the new models. He asked Julia how she had even known he wanted a street glide. She replied that a father deserved to have his dreams come true, and then her eyes met mine across the garage, and she asked for my agreement. The question hung in the air like a cloud of smoke from an extinguished candle. The celebration was happening all around me. Robert's grateful laughter, Julia's self-satisfied pride, and Logan's awkward silence. All I could hear was my own heart beating and the thought of my $20,000 retirement fund turning into chrome and leather that would never belong to me. I looked down at the cheap razor I was still holding in my shaking hand, then back at the Harley-Davidson that my money had purchased for someone else's father. I thought about how some people deserve the best, while others receive a $5 razor. And some people, I realized with a painful clarity that cut deeper than any blade, were about to find out what it was like to betray their father. I made my excuses and thanked Julia for the gift. I congratulated Robert on his new motorcycle and said I would call soon. The words felt like sawdust in my mouth, but I spoke them with the same dignity I had used during 40 years of factory work and union negotiations. The walk to my truck seemed to last forever. As I walked, I could hear Julia chatting excitedly about the motorcycle's features, Robert's continued amazement, and Logan's quiet, uncomfortable murmurs of agreement. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled for my keys. The engine rumbled to life, and I carefully backed the truck out of their driveway. In my rearview mirror, I could see the three of them silhouetted against the bright light of the garage, the chrome of that $20,000 machine gleaming between them like an accusation. The number, $20,000, kept circling in my thoughts as I drove home on the streets I knew so well. At the first red light, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The cheap razor was on the passenger seat in its plastic packaging, reflecting the red light. The math was simple and brutally clear. Julia had asked me for $20,000 3 months ago, and tonight, Robert had received a motorcycle that cost $20,000. It was the same amount, the same family, and the same time frame. But I couldn't bring myself to believe it. Surely my own daughter couldn't have looked me in the eye, with tears streaming down her face, and lied about a medical emergency. Surely she hadn't used my retirement savings to buy a luxury gift for someone else's father while giving me a cheap razor she had likely bought at a gas station. The light changed, and I continued driving, my body on autopilot as it followed the turns I had made thousands of times. I passed the old mill where I had worked for 30 years, the diner where I used to take Julia for ice cream, and the church where I had married her mother and later buried her. The memory of that day in March came back to me with a painful sharpness. Julia had called, sobbing and barely able to speak. She told me she needed help, that Logan's brother needed emergency surgery because they had found something during a checkup and his insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedure. She said she didn't know what else to do. I had gone to the bank immediately, without a single moment of hesitation. I hadn't asked for medical records or a second opinion because a father provides for his children without question. When I handed her the check, she had thrown her arms around me and whispered that I was the best dad in the world and that she didn't know how she would ever repay me. It now seemed that she had chosen to repay me with a cheap razor. By the time I arrived at my neighborhood, the sun had almost set. It painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple that now felt like a cruel joke. I pulled into my small, quiet driveway and sat there for a moment, just staring at my humble home. My entire life had been careful and methodical, built on decades of living frugally and saving for the future. A future Julia had convinced me to give away for a medical crisis that was starting to seem completely made up. I picked up the razor from the passenger seat and walked to my front door, each step heavier than the one before it. I knew what I would find, but I had to go inside to confirm it. I had to prove that my daughter had stolen my future and used it to buy chrome and leather for another man. The key turned easily in the lock, and I went inside, switching on lights as I made my way to the kitchen table where I kept my important documents. I realized that my $20,000 was about to become the most expensive lesson of my life. I carefully placed the razor box on the kitchen table and pulled out the chair where I had sat alone for so many meals since my wife, Margaret, passed away. The silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer peaceful, but tense, like the quiet before a storm. My hands were steady as I reached for my phone. After 40 years of factory work, I had learned to investigate things methodically and check facts before making assumptions. I found the number for the regional medical center in my contacts. I explained that I was calling about an emergency, possibly experimental, surgery for a patient named Logan Miller that would have happened in March. The person on the other end of the line paused for what seemed like an eternity before informing me that, due to HIPAA regulations, they could not give out patient information but could confirm that they had no record of any procedures for anyone with that name in March. My throat tightened. I asked if they could check for the name Miller or if maybe the surgery had been at North Valley Hospital. They could only speak for their own facility and suggested I call the other hospital directly. My second call was the same. There was no record of a Logan Miller, no emergency surgery, and no $20,000 procedure. I hung up and sat in the darkness, my phone still warm in my hand. The bank statement I had taken from my filing cabinet was staring back at me. It showed a withdrawal of $20,000 on March 18th with a note that said, "Emergency Medical Julia." I had signed that withdrawal slip myself, putting more trust in my daughter's tears than in any contract I had ever signed. My laptop was still sitting on the counter, and I moved it to the table with a mechanical motion. I went to the Harley-Davidson website, and as it loaded, I navigated to the 2025 models. The base price for a Street Glide Special was listed at $21,999, which was within $100 of the amount I had given Julia for a surgery that never happened. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair as the full weight of her betrayal settled on me like a heavy blanket. Julia hadn't just lied about needing money. She had created a fake medical crisis with tears and a sense of urgency to trick me into funding a gift for Robert while planning to give me a cheap razor. The rage that built up inside me was unlike anything I had felt since Margaret's death. It was a cold and clear and absolute certainty. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was the sharp anger of a man who had been completely betrayed by someone he had loved unconditionally. I picked up my phone and found Julia's number, my finger hovering over the call button as I thought about what to say. I wondered how you confront someone who has stolen not just your money, but also your trust. How do you explain to your own daughter that she has become a stranger? The cheap razor sat beside me, still in its packaging, a simple symbol of how little my sacrifice had meant to her. $20,000 for Robert's happiness and $5 for mine. But as I stared at her name on my phone, I felt a new sense of clarity. Calling her while I was angry would be pointless. She would just lie again, make excuses, and probably try to make me feel bad for not trusting her. No, if my daughter wanted to play games with my trust and my money, then it was time to remind her that I wasn't to be trifled with. I put my phone down without calling and walked into my study, where a picture of Margaret was smiling at me from the desk. I quietly asked her what she would do, but I already knew the answer. Margaret had never tolerated unfairness from anyone, not even our daughter. She would never have forgiven someone for taking advantage of a grieving widower's affection. It was time to show Julia who she was dealing with. I picked up my phone and found her contact information again, my finger hovering over her name for a moment. All the proof I needed was spread out on my kitchen table like a prosecutor's case file. Bank statements, hospital contact information, and printed screenshots of motorcycle prices. Everything I needed to destroy the belief that for 24 years, I had raised a daughter who loved me. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her voice bright and calm. She told me hi and thanked me again for coming that night, saying that Robert was still talking about the bike and that I had probably made his entire year. I replied that I was sure I had, my voice completely neutral. I told her I wanted to ask her about how Logan's brother was doing after his surgery. There was a very brief pause, so short that someone else might have missed it, but after 40 years of listening to union negotiations, I knew the sound of someone trying to buy time to create a lie. She said he was doing much better and that his recovery had been slow, but the doctors said he was making progress. I told her that was wonderful to hear and asked which hospital he was at because I wanted to send flowers. There was another, longer pause. She hesitated, saying she thought it was St. Patrick or maybe North Valley, adding that these things get mixed up when you're stressed. I leaned back in my chair, a cold satisfaction spreading through me. I told her that was interesting because I had called both hospitals that night, and neither had any record of treating anyone with that name for surgery. The silence between us was tense. When she finally spoke, the warmth was gone from her voice, and she asked me why I would call the hospitals and that it was a violation of privacy. I told her I had also called the medical center and urgent care and that the result was the same. No surgery, no Logan's brother, and no emergency procedure that required $20,000 of my retirement fund. She called me paranoid, suggesting that maybe it was under a different name. I interrupted her, my voice still calm, and said that maybe my daughter had looked me in the eye, cried real tears, and lied about a medical emergency so she could spend my money on a motorcycle for her father-in-law. I could hear her breathing getting faster on the other end of the line. She said that was ridiculous and that she couldn't believe I would accuse her. I brought up the $20,000 again, noting that it was the exact amount she had asked for in March, the exact cost of the Harley-Davidson Street Glide in their garage, and the same amount of money that bought a motorcycle for Robert while I was given a cheap razor. She called me crazy and insisted that the money for the surgery and the bike were not related, saying that she and Logan had saved for months. With what money? I asked, my question cutting through her desperation with a surgeon's precision. I reminded her that she had called me crying 3 months ago because she couldn't afford groceries and had asked for help with her mortgage payment just 6 weeks ago, but somehow she was able to save $20,000 for a motorcycle during that same time. Her composure was beginning to crack, and I could hear it in her voice as she responded. She told me I had no right to question her like that because she was my daughter, not a criminal. I quietly agreed, saying that a criminal would have shown more respect for their victim. She called me dramatic and said what if she had used the money differently than she said, and that the important thing was that it went to family. She explained that the money had gone to someone who needed some joy in their life because Robert had had such a hard year, and that I could afford to be generous. And there it was. No more denial or desperate lies, just a cold justification for stealing from her father. I slowly repeated her words about me being able to afford generosity. Did she really think that her old dad had so much money that he wouldn't even notice $20,000 was gone? She replied that she thought so, and that I always said I didn't need much and lived simply. She started to say that it wasn't like I was going to take it with me when I... And then she stopped herself. She said it was nothing and that she hadn't meant it, and then told me she was sorry if I felt deceived, but that the money had gone to a good cause because Robert deserved happiness, too. I asked her if that meant I only deserved a cheap razor. She became defensive and told me that it was a practical gift, and that since I was always complaining about how expensive electric shavers were, she had gotten me something simple and effective and thought I would appreciate not having to worry about charging cables and maintenance. I looked at the cheap razor on my table and then at the bank statement that showed my $20,000 withdrawal and thought about how she thought I would appreciate being treated like a burden while she played the lady of leisure with my money. She denied it, saying that if I was going to be ungrateful about everything she did, maybe we should limit our contact for a while, and that maybe I needed time to think about what family really meant. And there it was. The threat I had been expecting. that she would cut me off unless I behaved like a grateful fool. I told her quietly that maybe I did need to think about what family really meant and wished her a good night. I hung up before she could say anything else. The house became silent, and for the first time in hours, I smiled. I sat there as a peaceful feeling washed over me, and the house felt cleaner, as if exposing the truth had finally cleared away years of accumulated deception. I pushed back from the kitchen table and walked to my study, where a photograph of my wife, Margaret, was smiling at me. It had been 15 years since I had lost her, and for all that time, I had told myself that my sacrifices for Julia were what Margaret would have wanted. But looking at my wife's gentle eyes now, I wondered if I had been wrong. The wedding album was on the shelf behind Margaret's picture, its leather binding worn from the countless times I had taken it down to remember happier days. I opened it to a page I knew by heart. Julia at 23, glowing in a dress that had cost me $3,000 from a second mortgage. That dress had been just the beginning. The venue, the flowers, the reception for 200 people that Julia absolutely had to have. It all totaled $35,000, money I had borrowed against my house, while still raw with grief from losing Margaret. Julia had cried when I handed her the check, promising to pay me back and swearing she would make both her parents proud. She had never paid back a single penny. I closed the album and went to my filing cabinet, pulling out the folder I had labeled Family Finances. Every document inside told the same story. A devoted father emptying his accounts for a daughter who had learned to see his love as a weakness. There was a 401k withdrawal form from 5 years before, with a $5,000 early retirement penalty included, to help Julia and Logan with a down payment on their first house. I had assured her it was fine and that watching her succeed was worth more to me than my own financial stability. She had hugged me tightly in my kitchen, saying that the money meant everything to them, and that she and Logan would make sure I was taken care of when I was older and would never forget what I had done. But they had forgotten. Within 6 months, Julia was calling again, needing help with car payments, insurance, and unexpected expenses. Each request was smaller than the money for the house, but they were constant and persistent, like water wearing away stone. I walked to the living room window, looking out at the neighborhood where I had raised Julia after Margaret died. Those had been the most difficult years, working extra shifts at the factory while trying to be both a father and a mother to a grieving teenager. I had even sold Margaret's jewelry to pay for Julia's college applications, SAT prep courses, and dorm room deposits. On graduation day, with her cap slightly crooked, she had told me she was going to make me so proud and that everything I had sacrificed for her, she was going to make it worth it. For a while, it seemed as though she might. Her first job at the bank, her engagement to Logan, and the excitement in her voice when she called to share good news. But somewhere along the way, her gratitude had turned into an expectation. My willingness to help had become her right to receive. The surgery request 3 months ago had felt different, though more urgent and emotional than her usual financial appeals. Julia had shown up at my door in tears, clutching tissues and barely able to speak through her sobs. She told me she was so scared that they had found something on Logan's brother's physical, maybe a tumor, maybe cancer. She said he needed surgery right away, but their insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedure and that it was his only chance. She told me they needed $20,000 in cash because of the way the billing worked. I had written the check that same day, watching her relief as she held it to her chest like a lifeline. She told me I was saving his life and that she didn't know what their family would do without me. She had said, "our family," while planning to spend my money on chrome and leather for a man who wasn't even a blood relative to either of us. I went back to my study and sat heavily in the chair where I paid my bills and managed what was left of my finances. The truth was more painful than her lies. It was the realization that I had enabled this behavior for years. Every time I had said yes without questions, every time I had believed her promises without demanding accountability, I had taught her that my money was hers to manipulate. Margaret's picture seemed to be watching me as I fully processed my daughter's transformation from a grateful child to a calculating adult. My wife had been tougher than me, more willing to say no when Julia pushed boundaries. If Margaret were here now, she would probably tell me I should have stopped enabling Julia years ago. But Margaret wasn't here, and I had been so afraid of losing the only family I had left that I had lost myself instead. Tonight's $5 razor wasn't just an insult. It was a message. Julia had finally stopped pretending that she saw me as anything more than a source of funding for her generosity toward others. I picked up Margaret's photograph and looked at her familiar smile. I quietly asked her what she would do, just as I had earlier. But this time, I knew the answer. Margaret would never have tolerated someone taking advantage of a grieving widower's love. She would never have forgiven someone who turned genuine sacrifice into calculated manipulation. And she certainly wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life being treated like a fool by our own daughter. I set the photograph back in its place and stood up, feeling something change inside me. It wasn't my heart breaking, it was my spine straightening. For 15 years, I had been the victim, the grieving husband, the generous father who had been taken advantage of by those he loved most. It was time to remember who I used to be. I woke on the morning of June 16th with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The emotional turmoil of the previous night had become something harder and more determined. It was the cold satisfaction of a man who had finally stopped being a victim. I showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing the navy suit I had worn to Margaret's funeral and my best dress shoes. Today was not a day for casual clothes or uncertain decisions. Today was a day for business. The documents I needed were already organized on my kitchen table from the night before: property deeds, investment statements, insurance policies, and the bank records that told the story of my daughter's systematic exploitation. I slipped them into my leather portfolio, the same one I had carried to union negotiations for 40 years. The drive to downtown took 20 minutes through the streets that had watched me raise Julia from a grieving teenager to the woman who had stolen my retirement savings for chrome and leather. I drove past the high school where I had attended her graduation, certain she would make me proud, and past the bank where she worked, probably charming customers while figuring out how to manipulate her next victim. Attorney Margaret Chin's law office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house near the courthouse. I had chosen her because my Margaret had always said that successful women understood the value of other people's sacrifices better than most. Attorney Chin motioned for me to sit in the leather chair across from her mahogany desk. She said I had mentioned on the phone that I needed to make some significant changes to my estate planning. I sat down and opened my portfolio. I told her I wanted to completely revise my will, remove my current beneficiary, and leave everything to charity. She nodded professionally, pulling out a yellow legal pad. She noted that my current will left everything to my daughter, Julia, and asked what was prompting the change. I simply said that I had recently learned some things about family loyalty that had clarified my priorities. Attorney Chin's pen moved efficiently across her pad. I saw. She asked what type of charity I had in mind, and I told her the regional medical center because they did important work and didn't lie to elderly widowers about emergency surgeries that never happened. Her pen paused briefly, but she remained professional. That was certainly a worthy cause. She then asked if I wanted to leave Julia anything at all or completely disinherit her. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the plastic razor package I had been carrying since Father's Day. I told her I wanted to leave her $5,000 with a specific note that it was for the razor she gave me. For the first time, Attorney Chin's professional demeanor slipped slightly. She told me she wanted to make sure I understood the implications of what I was doing, noting that it would likely cause a significant family conflict and that the specific language about the razor could be seen as pointed. I replied calmly that that was exactly how I wanted it to be seen. I explained that my daughter had spent $20,000 of my money on a motorcycle for her father-in-law while giving me a $5 razor, and I wanted her to understand that I was capable of the same level of generosity she had shown me. Attorney Chin put down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She told me that, as my attorney, she was obligated to ensure I was making this decision with a clear mind and a full understanding of the consequences, and asked if I was prepared for Julia to potentially contest the will. I told her to let her try because I had documentation of every financial request, every lie, and every manipulation going back years. I said that if she wanted to contest my decision to stop funding her lifestyle, she was welcome to explain to a judge why she thought she was entitled to money she had obtained through deception. Attorney Chin told me she would prepare the documents and that it would take about 3 business days. She added that I would need 2 witnesses for the signing, neither of whom could be beneficiaries. I nodded, already thinking about who I would ask. She asked how much it would cost, and I wrote a check for $1,500 without hesitation. When could I return to sign? She said Friday morning, June 19th, at 10 a.m. I stood up and shook her hand, feeling lighter than I had in months. I thanked her and told her that for the first time in years, I was confident my money would go to people who actually deserved it. Walking back to my truck, I caught my reflection in the building's glass doors. The man looking back at me was not the defeated widower who had been manipulated by his daughter's tears. This was the man who had been a union negotiator and had never backed down from a fight when he knew justice was on his side. Julia had made the mistake of thinking her old dad was too weak and too desperate for family connection to fight back. In 3 days, she would find out just how wrong she was. A week had passed since my visit to Attorney Chin's office. I had signed the new will on Friday morning with 2 witnesses from the VFW Post, men who understood the importance of keeping promises and respecting those who had sacrificed for others. The documents were filed, the old will was revoked, and Julia's financial future had officially become someone else's problem. I spent the week in peaceful routine, morning coffee, afternoon walks, and evening reading. My phone was silent. Julia was apparently honoring her threat to limit our contact. I was beginning to think she had simply accepted the consequences of her actions and moved on. I was wrong. The first call came at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday, June 22nd. I was in my garden transplanting tomato seedlings that would outlive my relationship with my daughter when my phone buzzed. Julia's name was on the screen, and I let it ring. She left a message, saying hi, that she hoped I was having a good week, and asked me to call her back. 15 minutes later, she called again, leaving another message that she really needed to talk to me about something important. By 3 p.m., she had called 4 times. The messages were getting tenser and more controlled. She left a message saying that someone had mentioned seeing me at Attorney Chin's office last week, and that while she was sure it was just routine, she was starting to worry and asked me to call her. I turned off my phone and continued gardening. When I turned it back on at dinner time, there were 7 missed calls and increasingly frantic voicemails. She said she knew I was angry about our conversation last week, but that we were family and that whatever I was thinking about doing, I needed to talk to her first. She called me again, saying that this was getting ridiculous and that she had called 8 times. She asked me to pick up my phone and said that she had heard that I had changed my will and that that was crazy and that I wouldn't do something that drastic without talking to her first. The desperation in her voice was oddly satisfying. For years, I had been the one making anxious phone calls, worrying about her financial problems and scrambling to fix the messes she had created. Now she was learning what it felt like to be powerless and ignored. The 12th call came at 6:30 p.m. She apologized for the misunderstanding with the surgery money and said that she knew I was upset, but that we could work it out. She added that she and Logan had talked about it and were willing to pay me back for the motorcycle and pleaded with me not to do anything permanent over one argument. It was too late for that. By 7 p.m., the apologies had turned into threats. She said that this was ridiculous and that I was acting like a child having a tantrum, adding that Margaret would be ashamed of how I was behaving and that she would have wanted me to forgive my family, not throw us away over money. Bringing Margaret into this was a mistake. My wife would have stopped Julia's manipulative behavior years ago and would never have tolerated someone taking advantage of a grieving widower's love for his child. The final call came at 7:47 p.m. Julia's voice was barely controlled, thick with tears and desperation. She begged me to call her back, saying she knew she had made mistakes, but that she was my daughter and my only family, and that I couldn't just throw her away like this. I sat in my recliner listening to her voice break with the same emotional manipulation she had used to steal $20,000 from my retirement fund. The difference was that this time her desperation was real. This time she was the one facing consequences she couldn't control or charm her way out of. My phone remained silent for the rest of the evening. Julia had finally learned what it meant to be ignored by someone whose love she had taken for granted. I slept better that night than I had in years. The next morning brought no relief, only cold calculation. I had spent the sleepless night replaying those 17 unanswered calls, each one a testament to my complete powerlessness in the face of my father's systematic revenge. But lying in bed at dawn, watching Logan's peaceful sleep, I realized that direct appeals were the wrong strategy entirely. If Dad wanted to play hardball, I could play harder. I dressed carefully that morning. I wore a soft pink cardigan, minimal makeup to suggest vulnerability, and my mother's pearl earrings for that touch of innocent daughterly devotion. The coffee shop on Main Street would be full of familiar faces by 9:30, and I had a story to tell. Sarah Morrison had been our neighbor for 15 years, a woman whose currency was other people's business, and whose vault was nowhere near as secure as she believed. She sat alone at her usual corner table, drinking a latte and scrolling through Facebook with the dedication of a stock analyst. I went over and slumped into the chair across from her, letting genuine exhaustion do most of the acting. I told her what a relief it was to see a friendly face, and that I had been so worried about my father lately, and that I didn't know who to talk to. Her eyes lit up with the predatory interest of someone sensing fresh gossip. She asked me what was wrong with him. I said I probably shouldn't say anything, but asked if she had noticed him acting strangely lately, maybe being paranoid or making unusual decisions. Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper as she told me that now that I mentioned it, she had seen him at Attorney Chin's office last week, and that he had seemed very serious about something. Perfect. She was already connecting the dots. I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue I had strategically dampened before entering and told her that the doctor thought it might be early dementia. I said he had become so suspicious of his family and was convinced that people were trying to take advantage of him. Yesterday, I added, he told me he was planning to give away everything we have to strangers. She told me that was terrible and asked me what I was going to do. I said I didn't know and that he wouldn't listen to reason and wouldn't let me help him. I added that I was terrified he was going to do something irreversible before we could get him proper medical attention. By Sunday morning, the story had grown beautifully. At church, I found myself surrounded by concerned faces offering sympathy and advice about my father's declining mental state. Mrs. Patterson suggested adult protective services. Mr. Hendricks mentioned a lawyer who specialized in competency evaluations. Dr. Martinez quietly asked about my father's medical history and whether he had been evaluated for cognitive decline. It was so hard to watch someone you love lose themselves like this, I confided to the group. I added that he was convinced that his own family was plotting against him and that he had even accused me of stealing from him after everything I had done to take care of him. Logan stood beside me, nodding uncomfortably when prompted, adding just enough confirmation to make the story believable without actively lying. He's definitely been different lately, he managed when Mrs. Cooper asked directly. By Monday evening, I was meeting with Dad's former union buddies at Murphy's Tavern, where decades of workplace loyalty created the perfect audience for tales of a good man losing his grip on reality. Bobby always was too trusting, said Jim McNeil, nursing his third beer. Remember how he'd loan money to anyone with a sob story? Maybe that's coming back to bite him now. All that guilt about being taken advantage of. Exactly. I agreed, my voice heavy with daughter-like concern. He's become obsessed with the idea that everyone's after his money. He won't even let me help with his finances anymore. Says I'm trying to steal from him. It's heartbreaking. The beauty of the truth was how easily it bent to serve my purposes. Dad was making irrational financial decisions. Giving everything to charity instead of family was certainly that. He was pushing away people who cared about him. His own daughter, for instance. He was acting paranoid and suspicious, refusing to answer my calls. Proved that I wasn't lying exactly. I was simply providing context that helped people understand the situation from the perspective of a concerned daughter watching her father's mental decline. By Tuesday afternoon, I'd planted enough seeds to start a forest of doubt about Robert Crawford's competency. And the beautiful thing about small-town gossip was how quickly it spread through established networks, gaining authority with each retelling. I heard from 3 different people today that your father might be having some cognitive issues, Logan said that evening, loosening his tie as he walked through our front door. People are starting to ask questions. I smiled for the first time in days. Good. Maybe when enough people express concern, he'll finally listen to reason. But even as I savored this small victory, I knew it was only the beginning. Dad had underestimated my ability to fight back, just as I had initially underestimated his resolve. Now we were engaged in a different kind of warfare, one where community opinion and social pressure would determine the winner, and I intended to win. Margaret Henley's worried face appeared at my front door Wednesday morning like a harbinger of Julia's escalating desperation. At 72, Margaret had been my neighbor for 20 years, and her genuine concern was evident in every line of her weathered features. Robert, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but some folks are saying you haven't been feeling quite yourself lately. I invited her in for coffee, already understanding the purpose of her visit with crystalline clarity. Julia's rumor campaign had reached my doorstep just as I'd known it would. What exactly are people saying, Margaret? She fidgeted with her coffee cup, clearly uncomfortable. Well, there's talk about memory problems and some worry about some financial decisions you might be making. Julia's been quite concerned about your mental state. The audacity was breathtaking, even for Julia. After stealing $20,000 through systematic lies, she was now questioning my mental competency to cover her tracks. Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that my mental faculties are completely intact. In fact, I've never been more clear-headed about anything in my life. Relief flooded her face. Oh, thank goodness. I told everyone you seemed perfectly fine to me. But Julia was so convincing when she described your recent behavior. After Margaret left, I sat in my kitchen for exactly 5 minutes, allowing myself to feel the cold satisfaction of watching my daughter's desperation drive her to destroy her own credibility. Then I picked up my phone and called Attorney Chun. I need to schedule an emergency meeting. My daughter is spreading rumors about my mental competency, and I want to ensure my will is legally bulletproof. By 11 o'clock, I was sitting across from Attorney Chin's desk once again, this time with a comprehensive strategy for protecting my final wishes from Julia's inevitable legal challenges. The rumors about dementia could definitely complicate probate, Attorney Chin explained, her pen moving efficiently across a legal pad. We should arrange for a medical evaluation to document your cognitive state. I'd also recommend video testimony explaining your decisions, whatever it takes. I want it clearly established that every choice I've made has been the result of careful consideration by a competent adult. We'll also need character witnesses, people who can testify to your mental clarity and rational decision-making. The more documentation we have, the harder it will be for anyone to challenge your capacity. From her office, I drove directly to First Montana Bank, where I'd done business for 35 years. Branch manager Patricia Williams had known me since Julia was in high school, and her professional concern about my family situation was tempered by obvious respect for my financial acumen. Mr. Crawford, I've heard some concerning rumors about family conflicts affecting your financial planning. I want to assure you that all your accounts are secure and that we'll document any concerns about outside pressure or manipulation. Thank you, Patricia. I'm also scheduling a competency evaluation with my physician. I'll provide you with a copy of those results for your files. By 3 o'clock, I'd completed a circuit of strategic appointments that would create an unbreakable legal fortress around my final wishes. Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, my physician for 15 years, had scheduled me for a comprehensive cognitive assessment. 3 character witnesses, including Margaret Henley, ironically, had agreed to provide written statements about my mental clarity and rational behavior. My final stop was the county recorder's office, where I filed a formal affidavit declaring my complete mental competency and rational decision-making capacity regarding all recent financial and legal decisions. The young clerk behind the counter stamped the documents with bureaucratic efficiency. Will you need certified copies, sir? 6 copies, please. I have a feeling I'm going to need them. Driving home through the familiar streets of Kalispell, I reflected on the elegant irony of Julia's latest gambit. In trying to paint me as mentally incompetent, she'd forced me to create the most comprehensive documentation of my rational decision-making that any court could possibly require. Her rumor campaign hadn't weakened my legal position. It had strengthened it immeasurably. More importantly, it had revealed the true depths of her moral bankruptcy to anyone paying attention. A daughter who would spread lies about her father's mental health to protect her inheritance wasn't someone who deserved that inheritance in the first place. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the evening quiet, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed 40 years of my adult life in this town. Julia had escalated our conflict into social warfare, thinking she could manipulate community opinion to pressure me into reversing my decisions. Instead, she'd handed me the final proof I needed that my choice to disinherit her was not only justified but essential. Tomorrow, I thought it might be time to remind my daughter that her old man had learned a few things about strategic thinking during those 40 years of union negotiations. And unlike her rumor campaign, my next move would have the weight of documented truth behind it. 2 days of strategic planning had led to this moment. I'd watched Logan Sr. from my kitchen window that Thursday morning, polishing his motorcycle in the driveway across the street with the pride of a man who believed he'd received the generous gift of a loving daughter-in-law. It was time he learned the truth. I found him at Riverside Park around 2 o'clock, where he'd ridden the Harley for his daily exercise walk. The afternoon sun caught the chrome details as he secured his helmet to the handlebars, and I felt a stab of sympathy for what I was about to do to this decent man's peace of mind. "Beautiful bike, Logan," I called out as I approached the bench where he was stretching after his walk. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Robert, good to see you. And yes, she's a beauty, isn't she? Julia really outdid herself with this gift. I keep telling everyone I've got the most generous daughter-in-law in Montana." I sat down beside him, the manila folder containing bank statements and hospital records heavy in my hands. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. There's something you need to know about that motorcycle." He turned to face me, his expression shifting from contentment to mild concern. "What do you mean, Logan?" 3 months ago, Julia asked me for $20,000. She said it was for your son's brother's emergency surgery." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Surgery? What surgery? Logan doesn't have a brother who needed surgery. Never has had one, actually." The folder felt like it weighed 100 pounds. As I opened it, that's what I discovered when I started investigating. I called every hospital in the area. St. Patrick, Kalispell Regional, North Valley. Nowhere has any record of treating anyone in your family for surgery. Logan Sr. stared at the hospital contact sheets I'd printed out, his face growing pale. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with my motorcycle?" I pulled out my bank statement, pointing to the March 18th withdrawal. $20,000, Logan. The exact amount that Harley cost. The exact amount Julia told me she needed for a medical emergency that never happened. The silent stretch between us was like a physical thing. I watched his face as the mathematics clicked into place. As the horrible realization dawned that he'd been riding around on money stolen from the father of the woman who'd given it to him. "You're telling me?" His voice came out hoarse. "You're saying Julia took your money under false pretenses and bought my motorcycle with it?" "I'm saying your daughter-in-law looked me in the eye, cried real tears, and lied about a medical emergency to manipulate me into funding her generosity toward you." He stood up abruptly, pacing to the motorcycle and back, his hands clenched into fists. "That manipulative little. How could she do this? How could she make me an accomplice to stealing from you? You weren't an accomplice, Logan. You were another victim." "No." He shook his head violently. "I accepted a $20,000 gift without asking questions. I should have wondered how she afforded it. I should have." He trailed off, staring at the bike with newfound revulsion. "You trusted family. That's not a crime." He turned back to me, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "But theft is, and lying about medical emergencies to manipulate an elderly widower. That's not just theft, Robert. That's evil." I stood up, feeling oddly protective of this decent man's moral outrage. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make this right." His voice carried the steel of a man who'd worked construction for 40 years and never cheated anyone out of a day's pay. "I'm selling this motorcycle today, and you're getting your money back, every penny." "Logan, I appreciate that, but..." "No buts." He was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Julia right now, and she's going to explain herself. Then we're going to the Harley dealer, and I'm trading this thing in immediately." As he dialed, I felt the satisfaction of watching justice unfold through the moral clarity of a good man who discovered he'd been made complicit in wrongdoing. Julia had counted on Logan Sr.'s gratitude and lack of curiosity to keep her secret safe. She'd miscalculated the character of the man she'd chosen to manipulate. Logan Sr.'s phone call to Julia was brief and commanding. "Get over to my house right now. We need to talk about that motorcycle, and it can't wait." I drove home to wait, knowing that within hours the money Julia had stolen would be returned and her manipulation would be exposed to the last person who'd held her in any regard. The call came at 4 o'clock. "Robert, it's done." Logan Sr.'s voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd righted a serious wrong. "Julia tried every trick in the book, crying, denying, blaming you for being paranoid. But when I told her I knew about the fake surgery and threatened to call the police, she folded like a bad poker hand." "What happened?" "We drove straight to the Harley dealer. I made her watch while I sold that bike back to them for $19,500. Took a small loss, but I covered the difference myself. She didn't say a word during the entire transaction, just sat in the corner looking like someone had died. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the same chair where I'd opened Julia's Father's Day gift 3 weeks ago. Logan, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just tell me where you want to meet so I can give you your money back. An hour later, Logan Sr. stood in my living room holding an envelope containing $20,000 in cashier's checks. His face showed the deep satisfaction of a man who discovered corruption and systematically destroyed it. I want you to know something, Robert. I've lost all respect for that girl. What she did to you, lying about medical emergencies, stealing from her own father while he was still grieving his wife. That's not just theft. That's a special kind of evil. I accepted the envelope with steady hands, feeling the weight of justice finally served. You didn't have to make up the difference yourself. Yes, I did. I rode around on your stolen money for weeks, feeling grateful to the woman who robbed you. The least I could do was ensure you got back every penny. He moved toward the door, then paused. Robert, I want you to know that I've told Logan exactly what happened. He's ashamed of his wife, but he's stuck with her. As for me, Julie is not welcome in my house anymore. I won't pretend to respect someone who would steal from a grieving widower. After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen, holding the envelope containing my returned money. Outside, the Montana summer evening was settling into the kind of golden quiet that Margaret had always loved. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out the new will, reading Attorney Chin's precise language about charitable bequests and the $5,000 gift to Julia for the razor she gave me. The irony was perfect. Julia's greed and manipulation had cost her not just my love and respect, but an $800,000 inheritance. Her lies had been exposed to the entire community, her reputation destroyed by her own actions, and her relationship with Logan Sr., the man she'd tried to impress, permanently severed. And all because she'd thought her old man was too weak and too desperate for family connection to fight back when she stole from him. I looked at Margaret's photograph on my desk and smiled. Justice served, sweetheart. Exactly the way you would have wanted it. The phone rang one more time that evening. Julia's number appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I answered. Hello, Julia. Dad, please. Logan Sr. is being completely unreasonable. I can explain everything if you'll just. No need to explain, I said quietly. I understand perfectly. You stole $20,000 from me using a fabricated medical emergency, spent it on someone else, and gave me a $5 razor. The only thing left to understand is how you became someone I no longer recognize as my daughter. Dad, you can't. I hung up and turned off my phone. Outside my window, the street was peaceful and quiet. Inside my house, justice had been served, dignity restored, and the future secured for people who actually deserved it. Margaret Crawford's widower had finally learned to stop being a victim. And that, I thought, was the best Father's Day gift I could have given myself. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.